Hello, class, and welcome to Week 3 in Introduction to Neuroscience. My name is Dr. Neil Soggie, and this week I'd like to tell you a little story. Now, the criminal brain has always been a fascination for Dr. James Fallon. For nearly 20 years, the scientist at the University of California at Irvine has studied the brains of psychopaths. He studied the biological basis for behavior, and one of his specialties is to try and figure out how a killer's brain differs from yours and mine. About 4 years ago, Fallon made a startling discovery. It happened during a conversation he had with his aging mother, Jenny. Now, Jenny Fallon looked at her son and said, "Jim, why don't you find out about your father's relatives? I think there was a few cuckoos back in the day on his side of the family." And so James Fallon did investigate. And he discovered that there was a whole lineage of very violent people. In fact, they were killers. One of his direct great-grandfathers, Thomas Cornell, was hanged in 1667 for murdering his mother. The line of Cornells produced 7 other alleged murderers, including Lizzie Borden, also known as Cousin Lizzie, as Fallon Riley calls her, who was accused and controversially acquitted of killing her father and stepmother with an axe in Massachusetts in 1882. Now, a little spooked by his ancestry, Fallon set out to find out whether anyone in his family possesses the brain of a serial killer, because he'd studied the brains of dozens of psychopaths and he knew precisely what to look for. And this is the orbital cortex, the area that Fallon and other scientists believe is involved in ethical behavior, moral decision-making, and impulse control. People with low activity in the orbital cortex are either freewheeling types or sociopaths, he says. Now, Fallon had obviously oversimplified this, but Fallon says the orbital cortex puts a brake on another part of the brain called the amygdala, which is involved with aggression and appetites. But in some people, there's an imbalance. The orbital cortex isn't doing its job, perhaps because the person has had a brain injury or they were born that way. So what's left? The area of the brain that drives your id type of behavior. If you think in terms of Freudian psychology, the id is involved in things like rage, violence, eating, sex, drinking. Now, Fallon says nobody in his family has real problems with their behaviors, but he wanted to be sure. So, conveniently, he had everything he needed. Previously, he had persuaded his close relatives to submit to a positron emission tomography brain scan and give a blood sample as part of a project to see whether his family had a risk of developing Alzheimer's disease. After learning his violent family history, he examined the images and compared them with the brains of psychopaths. His wife's scan, normal. His mother, normal. His siblings, normal. His children, normal. And then James says he took a look at his own positron emission tomography scan and saw something disturbing that he didn't really want to talk about. His orbital cortex looks inactive. James says, if you look at the PET scan, I look like one of those killers. Now, James Fallon cautions that this is a young field and scientists are still trying to figure things out. So the brain may not necessarily mean that someone is definitely going to become a criminal, but the evidence, he says, is accumulating that some people's brains predispose them toward violence. And having discovered that his own brain was like this, he wanted to find out more. So the next part of Jim Fallon's family experiment was to get the DNA for genes that are associated with violence. And he looked at 12 genes related to aggression and violence and zeroed in on a specific gene known as the warrior gene. And this affects serotonin because serotonin reduces the sense of danger. And then Fallon looked at this gene and it was the same except for one person, him. And so he acknowledges, I see it. I have a pattern, the risky pattern, he says. In a sense, I am a born killer. Now, Fallon says this tongue-in-cheek, but he does recognize that his biology has set himself up to be at risk of certain behaviors. Now, there's another factor that comes in. Being exposed to stress and violence in early childhood. And James Fallon says, thankfully, he was not abused as a young person. And so, as things go, he's very well set. But he recognizes that he has received a bad roll of the dice. And that brings us to the question of neurolaw. Will we come to the point someday where a simple brain scan deems someone as a risk or may be used as evidence in court? I hope you enjoy this week. You take care. Bye-bye.